So if we're ready, we are very happy to have the panel set up this way. And now we will have 45 minutes for discussion where Madeleine and I will sort of just try to be the traffic cops and ask some questions ourselves. But then, of course, the floor is mostly just open to everyone. I am tempted to begin because I thought it was a very interesting contrast just now between two different approaches. And one is to try to talk about climate change and the ethical responsibility by rejecting certain discourses and conceptualizations and even political and geopolitical tools for trying to achieve these things. So I guess, Mickey said this very clearly. Why not just give up on all that and we'll just power to the people in some way? We'll do it in a different way because this is not working. But then we had John Broome, who was sort of saying that, well, as a philosopher who wants to be effective, I will just, talk to the economists on their own terms and sort of see what just follows from their language, even though it's extremely insufficient for our purposes, but that's probably the way to be effective. So I wonder, I'm curious to hear everyone's opinion about the value of these different two approaches. Should we be doing both of them? Is one approach philosophy and the other not philosophy, as was suggested? Or is it something that we should be doing both at the same time? So maybe if I can just begin with John, because you started this. How could you begin by explaining just briefly how you see the value of your approach, sort of why you take this approach? I'm sorry, the sound is not on.
Thank you very much. I seem to be working. Yes, I have learned that if philosophy is to be effective in doing something about climate change, it has to speak to governments. There are a lot of philosophers who've worked on the idea of instilling green virtues, making people behave better, understand the harm that they're doing and respond to that in their individual behavior. But I'm sorry to say, however effective that is, it's not going to be enough to deal with climate change, because climate change is caused by the 8 billion people we have in the world, many of whom are beyond the reach of any considerations of that sort. Climate change can only be dealt with by the institutions that have the power, and those are the governments. Maybe some other big institutions too, for example, the fossil fuel companies. We certainly need to deal with them. But as individuals, I'm afraid, whatever we do is not going to achieve much. Let me say that I very much admire the work that Amanda is doing, because I think that our governments need to be pushed into behaving in the way they should about climate change. And the present formal mechanisms of elections and so on are quite inadequate to do that. So activism of various sorts is necessary in order to get our governments to behave the way they should, but we will not solve climate change unless our governments start behaving differently. And indeed, unless we have cooperation among governments to do this. So to begin with, when I started working on the philosophy of climate change, I did write on individual behavior, how we should respond to climate change. And indeed, I mentioned that in my talk. I talked about the harm that we as individuals do. And I said that it is a duty of justice that we owe to other people not to do those harms. But to get action, to get climate change fixed, we have to think about the ethics of governments as well as the ethics of individuals. So that's the approach that I now take, because I think it's the one that's most likely to be effective.
Okay, thank you very much.
Could I just add one thing? I am, though, pessimistic. I'm sorry to say, I've become quite cynical about this process. I can't say that I'm hopeful that we will succeed in dealing with it, but the only way we have a chance is to get our governments to behave properly.
Thank you very much. Maybe we will, Amanda, if you want to say a few words first, because out of courtesy for those who are not present with us here. Yeah. Then we move to the rest of the panelists.
Of course, I already been
talking about this.
I already highlighted this topic,
right.
But I can also, just to add, I don't think that we can afford to not use all ways possible act on this. That's my perspective. But then I think it's difficult also because if we want our politicians to act, we need the pressure from the public. But if our politicians says that it's cool, that we can handle the climate crisis, we know what we are doing, then the public will not have the incentives to actually push their politicians. So I think to blame the politicians is correct, but we should also in a way blame the public for not being more educated in this topic. If we want the politicians to act, we have to push them.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Maybe Mickey, if you want to be next, and then we just take the role here.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. As Ellen and Amanda discussed a bit around the responsibility of society versus the responsibility of the individual, and you agreed that you can't sort of say it's either or, it's both. And I hear the same from John Broom now, that it's not a question of individuals or governments, it's both, and you have decided to put your pound of falafels in the ball of governments, and I agree that it's important that we do both, right? That someone is inside trying to tweak the wheels by talking the language that politicians respect, and we have someone standing outside doing the opposite. So we can basically just agree and everyone can be at peace, but I would like to question that based on something Carolyn said, is that isn't there a fear that we lose something very, very important when we translate what is important into numbers? And you mentioned it yourself, John, in the beginning of your speech, that they couldn't grab everything. But then you said, so they're probably too low, but I would say that they're not there, right? The extinction of the albatross, no matter how many trillions of dollars you put on that, will never be enough, because it's not about numbers, it's a tragedy. The idea of the BNP, is that in English as well? Yes. I mean, I've never met an economist who thinks that BNP shows anything important, right? They realize themselves that this doesn't really show anything about how good we are faring. Nonetheless, we are still using it, right? So as much as I would like us all to come together and just have different roles in the same game, I think we might lose something if we accept talking the language of numbers. Yeah.
Okay, so it's been a very interesting discussion. I really loved your slides with we are the asset managers of nature, because it was kind of echoing what I was trying to criticize, was this total takeover of a regime over our language, like economization of everything, nature services. And once there was a survey done in Iceland to evaluate the value of Icelandic nature, or basically the highlands of Iceland, which is like 80% of the surface of Iceland. And they found out the value of Iceland they called people, they used some, it was a Department of Economics, they did it. So the value of the Icelandic highlands was, I think it was like $500 million. And I was like, do you really think you could erase the highlands of Iceland and give us $500 million and that would be a compensation? Like it was as much as the value of the local Coca-Cola company. You know, so it was just, and I just started to really dislike the surrender to this rhetoric, and I really felt like I wanted to fight very severely back against those rhetorics and just go into religion or poetics or just claim some new spaces. And I feel like when people are listening to indigenous knowledge, that is also the failure of this rhetoric and our longing to find other ways to explain nature. The point of the young people, I talk to a lot of young people and I feel this climate anxiety and I try to find hope just for my own survival and my own mental health, and that hope is that Greta Thunberg generation is finally the generation that is born around the time the word ocean acidification was mentioned the first time, and maybe it is the first generation that actually understands it, while I am the generation that does not understand it. And this generation has had young people mobilizing 100,000 of their peers in the streets, talking to science. Nobody of my generation did that. So I think, or I wishfully believe, that this generation will take power quite early because they have so much activist, and they're also not cursed with the year 2000 as the future, because that's like an imaginary wall on our heads. We still think 2000 is the future, and they don't belong to that curse. So my daughters are paying into pension funds to get their first payments in 2075. You know, so they are deeply connected to this century, so when I talk to the young people, I say, okay, you're not essentially unlucky to be born today. You know, it was difficult to be born in Iceland 1918, like when my grandmother was sent 8 years old to another part. It was difficult to be born in Europe in 1940. It was difficult to be born 18-something. So each generation has had lots of challenges. Now we do have many tools to solve the problem. And it just means that it doesn't matter what you choose in your working life. If you go into fashion, fashion has to be revolutionized. If you go into farming and food, food and farming has to be revolutionized. If you go into technology, we have like 1,000 gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we need to find a solution to draw it down or do something about it. If you go into any field you go into, there's this paradigm shift. This is the central kind of, if you go into energy, we have to reform all energy. And also this calculation of CO2 versus human lives. There's also the other side of it, that I am not 70% water. I'm probably 90% oil. That is, I would probably not be here if we had not found this excess energy to make our lives this superpower that oil has given us. So can I stop being 90% oil and become 70% wind or something? That is the big challenge of transitioning from so they exist. So we're so ingrained in this system that it's almost impossible to. It's like Siamese twins or something. We're cutting. Our organs are grown into the oil, and just the whole system is so grown together that it's very difficult for us to kind of rip out of this in language, in systems, in politics, in everything. So I don't know where I'm going now. So next.
Okay, I'll try to contribute just a couple of points. I think we need to be inclusive. I don't think that one approach precludes another. I think having listened for a couple of days to all these philosophical presentations, etc., I think definitely the philosophical approach, it has much to offer. However, I would not want to exclude the economic approach either, and the use of metrics. I think it has a lot to offer, and I think that the real world is extremely complex, and being able to boil things down to something abstract that we can actually follow has incredible value. Without some kind of metric that we are following, how are we going to take the pulse on where we are headed and how effective we have been? Otherwise, it just becomes a lot of words. And I think there has been some talk about gross domestic product. It was mentioned by the first speaker, you know, that has been criticized a lot. Yes, there are a lot of imperfections in that measure of what the size of an economy is. On the other hand, if we follow the evolution of that and look at how the United Nations itself is using it in the measure of the Human Development Index, it has changed, and we now have something called the Genuine Progress Indicator, which is a kind of change GDP that takes into consideration the harm that we do to the environment. So by having these metrics, we can also follow how we are changing as a society and how we view the importance of nature. We see that in the metric itself and the definition. So without that, we wouldn't have much. I also wanted to say that I think that just as scientists, in order to realize progress, we need to become better at communicating with policymakers. So a lot of the failures that we have is simply because we are not very good at communicating with each other, that there is a lack of a connection there, and often it is not about just creating more science or better science, but about taking what we know and communicating it better. And I like the idea of, you know, also bringing more attention to just everyday people and hearing the voices of everybody. And we talked about that yesterday, the importance of bringing everybody's perspective into the conversation and having dialogues with people also in the kind of language that they speak, that it's not just about scientific knowledge, but also traditional and indigenous and local knowledge.
So I think that we need all in the same boat. And I think that we need to be in the tables, not the same persons, but the different persons and from the different disciplines or different expertise to talking and also participating. We need to have a plan, how to go forward, the strategy, how to different steps going forward. And I know that it's frustrating that these official organs, they are so slow. For example, when we have these dioxins and other things which are real toxic chemicals, it took so long time to have the global agreements for those. And we have a lot of many other cases also. And that's why I think that it's different levels, different steps going forward. And I think that when I was calculating how much the broken leg would be in money, I was first thinking, oh gosh, this is not, but of course that is the one word which is important, is how we share our joint money, for example, in the government and national level, on the municipalities and other things. And that's why we need also that kind of language. We have different languages, we need that. And also in a medical treatment and also research, I don't lose anything if I just also calculate in that way and talk in a that kind of tables, what kind of demands there are for the hospital. But I think that one of the important issues which we have not talked at all, this is the COVID-19 pandemic. We have learned a lot of different types of the skills. It is so important to take those good ones to be used in a way. so that we can save the energy, but in that way that we don't lose the social connectivity and other things, so that we have the different issues. And now we have the energy. That is a blessing for us, because we need to go back to those things which we really need to do. And I think that is a huge opportunity. I'm working also with the plastics, micro and nanoplastics, and it's much easier to tell people how dangerous the plastics are, because you can see the plastic bags all over. But when you are talking about climate change, it's really difficult to have the concrete actions somehow in a very huge amount of people to understand the points which is going on. But I think that these are the issues we can think about what we can do. And I definitely think that we all are needed to be together. So thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I'm only going to say a couple of things, because I'm sure that, well, I don't know, but my head is absolutely spinning with lots of kind of things that I'm thinking. But one thing I wanted to say was related to Nietzsche. Actually, I'll speak in this. I've got this one on. Sorry. I didn't like Nietzsche for a long time because he's very misogynist. But I've come round to his idea of the eternal return. And in terms of what John was saying, a few years ago, a memo was leaked from the World Bank where somebody did a QALY calculation on exporting toxic waste and worked out that it was, in terms of QALYs of people who are productive, much better to export toxic waste to countries where people were poorer because their lives were worth less. And the reaction to that was not, oh, well, that's okay then. The reaction was moral outrage. And that leads me to a second point, which is I have, and this relates to Nietzsche, I have a wonderful, wonderful colleague who teaches on our ethics class. He used to teach, actually. He's retired now. Called Jack Dowie. And he was very good at game theory. He was also an economist. And he used to outrage the students by making them play a game where they calculated the value of people's lives in different scenarios. And the reaction of people, and these are people who've been more or less contaminated by scientific education. So they've been pretty brainwashed. Even given that, and most of them were statisticians and doing health economics, even given that, they reacted morally, which told me something, and they hated Jack. So Jack used to have to come every year and stand up in front of them and say, I'm about to make you play a game, but my wife told me to tell you that I'm a nice person because it really affects me if you don't like me when I go home. That told me that however much you brainwash people with that kind of training, and I'm talking about postgraduate and PhD students, you do not take out of them that ethical reflection. So if we are going to talk about economics, and the School of Tropical Medicine is full of people who do that, I don't talk to them very much, we need to do this in a very clever way. We need to really, really quantify, and the New Economics Foundation is doing this brilliantly, quantify properly the distributional economics of what's going on, which is what we were talking about yesterday, how you actually distributionally calculate that. And I see a role for that, but you need to do it properly. And you don't just say we, because we're not talking about we won't be affected by this. We won't. We might be in a bit, and you can threaten people with it, but we won't. Not in the same way that people in other parts of the world are already being threatened. That's one thing. The other thing I wanted to say is related to what's going on that I'm seeing in education, which is as a completely different field that I kind of teach in. We've just finished a book on globalization and health with political scientists, and one of the things that interests me is the power of the state related to the power of other actors. So if we devote all our energies to how we communicate with people we call leaders or decision makers, we have to realize that the role of the state has diminished immensely, despite the last 2 years watching states playing at God. So then we have to think, well, how do we as educators convey something that allows people to understand that world? And so what I'm really fascinated about is our students have been given free rein in one of the courses I teach on globalization. And last year, the students came with fast fashion and health. Not just climate change, Bitcoin and the proliferation of monetary freedom. And we were really challenged because we didn't know how to actually assess that kind of essay, because people were pushing us as educators way beyond our comfort zones. And that tells me as an educator that we need to paradigm shift as well, because we need to actually allow people the scope to explore stuff and causal relationships that are way beyond what we were thinking before, which is going back to the paradigm shift we were talking about. So enabling people to write essays about the ethics of economics, for example, enabling people to think about that and giving them the space to think about that would be something I would think is progressive as well, because that enables people like Amanda to think, well, actually, what would a paradigm shift mean in a place where the state has very little power, even though I'm voting for a state, in the overall scheme of things? You know, that's rambling, but anyway.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for your for obliging us by answering this initial question. Really interesting. But now I'm sure you have many questions in the audience to ask either specific speakers or all of them, but preferably specific speakers, I suppose, for the sake of time. Niels.
I'm here because I'm a member of the committee, which is on bioethics. And I know nothing about ethics. I'm a medical doctor trying to keep patients alive. But now we have been here for 2 days, and my impression is that everybody agrees that something should be done. But is that bioethics? I would like if we, as a member of this committee, having been here for 2 days now, I would like you in some way to sharpen down and say, what are the bioethical problems? And of course, there's really a lot of problems. But if one example in my world would be if you want to make better brakes on a car, not to kill people. Of course, that's a problem we have in the hospital. But in my opinion, it's not a bioethical problem. It's a problem with brakes. And there's a huge problem with brakes and a lot of people killed in the traffic. But is it a medical ethical problem? And the same here, is this really a medical ethical problem? Because it has to do with communication, with the way we, with transportation, with our clothes and so on. So I would really like if you could try to sharpen down on this and say, these are the bioethical problems.
Can I give an example? I mentioned it actually, that the British NHS is deciding to spend some of the money that it's been given for improving health on reducing its carbon emissions. And this will actually be quite a substantial amount of its resources. Now, this ethical question, how much should it do that? What is its responsibility towards reducing climate change throughout the world in comparison with its responsibility of curing British people from diseases? Unfortunately, the document that it produced didn't really explain how it was making that decision, where it got the idea from that it should be doing this. But it should be thinking about that. It should be asking, if we reduce our emissions, is that the best way of using our resources? Or would it be better if emissions were reduced elsewhere rather than in the health service?
Thank you, John. Andre and then Mickey.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm not an ethicist, I think maybe the medical community, that is the discussion of climate change has been very much biologists and like I was trying to explain, the staggering difference of when medical doctors enforced on us the corona response versus what has happened when biologists tell us the planet is being destroyed due to climate change. So maybe we could discuss this, but doctors as people with literacy to understand much of the biological material, that they have kind of not entered this discussion on any force. It's almost like it's, you know, the IPCC is one thing, and then the medical community is another thing, but then comes this crisis that is kind of, like I said, a paradigm shift, which is another reality that will severely change the challenges of all medicine and doctors in this century. So the question is, does the medical community have the moral obligations to look at this data, translate that into their knowledge, and perhaps participate in what kind of policy we need to have, because they will be then talking about lives of people that they will be dealing with in the next 30, 40, 50 years. I'm not sure. That's, yeah.
I think. Yeah, okay. I like your question. What are we good for? I've been doing what is called applied ethics for 25 years, which is a term I always hated because I have no idea what non-applied ethics is. But it's. I mean, your example, the brakes that doesn't work lead to persons being damaged in the hospital. We all agree, fix the brakes. What's the ethics of this? We need doctors to fix the damages, but what if it isn't that the brakes aren't working? Because actually I think that it's rarely that causes traffic accidents. It's more that we have this combination of wanting to keep people safe and wanting to have an active economy, and we try to outweigh these two with making speed limits that we know will cause some damages, right? And how we balance that is an ethical question, right? So that's where ethics come in, but basically I think your frustration, I hear that, I teach science students ethics, right? They're so frustrated because they want to know, is this right or wrong, right? They want a hammer, they want solutions to problem, and obviously we all agree, climate change is wrong because living an affluent life that causes immense damage to the planet and other people is wrong. Yes, so the question is what to do, but that's not a technical issue, that's also an ethical issue. How should we solve the crisis within the food sector that you mentioned, right? Should we change our diets? Or should we use GMO to make CO2 emission-free cows by biotechnology? That's an ethical issue. So you can't escape that values enter all choices in this discussion. And the easy part of it is discussing whether climate change caused by humans is wrong or not. I mean, we don't have to have conferences to decide that. It's how to react to that it's wrong that demands ethical conferences.
But it's more that we have 3 letters, bio. We assume it's ethical, but is it bioethical?
Yes, bio means life. So anything that's connected to life is relevant for bioethics, and climate change is, to a very large degree, something that damages life in all its shapes.
Yeah. Yeah, Joachim Rocklov made that very clear in his first, I mean, the connections with life and health and so on. Carolyn was next. We have lots of, so Carolyn, then Arya, and then Ellen, I think, if I have it right.
No, I'd be interested to know what everyone else in the room thinks, because actually it depends, for me, how you define bioethics. And I've been teaching medics in an ethics course, and we decided, I mean, medics tend to be like mechanics, so it's very interesting you use that term, particularly Western medics, because allopathic medicine is entirely mechanical, really. It's not like Ayurveda or Unani medicine, which deals with the spirit as well. That's to provoke you, actually. So I don't actually know how schools of medicine work here, but the way our students like to think about it is around the nitty-gritty of a doctor's relationship with the patient, which is roughly what Cheryl was talking about yesterday, and moving that from an individual ethic through to a community ethic, through to a world ethic. And in the world ethic, we discuss how people can get their heads around their responsibility as individuals, but also as professionals to other people on the planet, if you like, and other beings on the planet. And the students want that. So I think that's refreshing, that even though, as I said earlier, they've been brainwashed into a certain trend in their understanding of the world, a lot of medics, who are mostly clever people, they're very good at numbers and stuff, they want to be challenged to think about these things and how they can contribute to it. And on a really cynical note, if you are just this is really cynical actually, if you're just publishing in a philosophy paper, they have impact factors of 0. If you get Richard Horton, who's the editor of The Lancet, interested in thinking about these issues, you reach many more people and people's careers are advantaged. If you get it into Nature, as Joaquin was pointing out yesterday, you reach many more people. So in a sense, if you've got students wanting it, if you've got the medical community wanting it, you've got another voice that adds to that set of voices. And it's quite a powerful voice, which is, again, why Dante put them in the 7th level of hell with the lawyers.
Thank you, Carolyn. I just noticed that it's 1 o'clock already, so but I have promised Arya and then Ellen to say just a few words, and then we'll have to close it.
So about the bioethics, I think that when I have been thinking about this, many disciplines together, how to work, and we health people, we have more restrictions so that we cannot ask the same questions like people from economy or some other fields from the individuals. And I think that now when we are starting a PhD courses concerning the transdisciplinary ethics, and I think that we should also include technology and other things in this big picture, because perhaps people are thinking that bioethics is too restrictive, so that there's leaving something out. In my mind, not, but perhaps the term is a little bit, how I could say, people don't get the point. I think that talking about the transdisciplinary ethics or something like that, it's much more inclusive than bioethics. But that is only my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your question because I think it is worth to think about what really is bioethical, or what is bioethics in respect to this conference or into all these talks. And I think the way I see it, we have brought up many speakers. We have talked about many different values: the value of health, the value of nature, the value of a thriving economy. For example, Andri brought up the idea of, you could put a price on the lands of Iceland. The problem is that, we're dealing with incomparable values in a sense. You cannot put a price on Iceland. You cannot weigh all the time the value of health against the value of, climate justice. And I think that this is where the ethical part of it comes in. Bio, as I see it, is more the fact that we're discussing something that is biological. We're discussing health and climate. The ethical discussion comes in of how should we weigh these different values against each other. When you speak about incomparable values, sometimes you deal with uncertainty. I think that the problem here is that it's not so uncertain. We know that the climate is changing, and we know that these effects are coming. Usually in ethics, you say that the rightness or wrongness of something is judged by future generations. And you know, when we judge our ancestors and we speak about slavery, for example, or something else that now is considered wrong, you can hear people saying, oh, but you know, they didn't know better. I think the problem now is like we do know better. We have the knowledge. We know that this is happening. So it puts an even heavier responsibility of weighing these different values against each other. And I think that's where ethics really comes in. What principles should we use then?
Okay, now I'll give the microphone to the chair of our committee, Madeleine Haley.
Well, I'd just like to thank all of our speakers today and everyone that was here yesterday that's not with us now, and thank everyone who's been participating very actively, and to our technical staff that has been doing all the live sending, and to all the audience that's been watching online that can't be with us here in the room. So thank you, everyone, and I think we can all share in a round of applause for all our speakers. And with that, I close this conference and hope that we'll see a brighter future.